Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
A hush filled the air and chills flitted across her skin. There was a gasp of recognition and then disbelief. The man in a pilot's uniform had been silently sitting and staring at the seat back in front of him. The only thing that was odd about him was the very fact that he wouldn't even acknowledge those around him. In the first class seat of Flight 318, Sis stomped her way toward the pilot. She tells him about the man who isn't answering her questions. She has asked him his name 3 times now, and he isn't accounted for. He must be deadheading, but he just refuses to acknowledge that she is even there. George, the pilot, huffs in annoyance. Fine. He gets up from his seat, and he makes his way to the passengers. Seeing the man seated with a pilot's hat on, he notices that the man isn't moving. He is truly just ignoring all of those around him. George wants to get on eye level with this man, so he crouches down, keeps his balance with a hand on the seat beside him, and when he raises his eyes to look at the silent man, he rocks back in disbelief. His heart starts to pound hard in his chest, and he gasps out the word, "That's Bob Loft." Bob Loft, his friend who died in a plane crash, who was now sitting in the first class seat on his plane. And then he simply disappeared. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hi, hello, I am your host Kayla, and welcome back. If you came here from the Darkcast Network, welcome. I'm glad you are here. If you're a normal listener, thank you for coming back. I really appreciate it. This episode, I did cover roughly 8 minutes of it for the mini episode that came out on Halloween. So we are going into a little bit deeper of a dive of this episode this time. And I do want to mention I've actually got 2 things to mention. The one is related to the story, which is if you go looking for stories about the ghosts of Flight 401, you will find a ton of stories out there. And they're all just kind of mushed into this time. We'll get into it. But they're mushed into this time after the crash and while parts of this plane were being used on other planes. And it's just so eerie, just the circumstances surrounding it. The second thing that I want to mention is that I had somebody reach out. They left a comment on Spotify saying that Harry Truman was not the one who said Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. It was somebody else who said that. So, again, I am human. I make mistakes. I'm happy to own up to those mistakes. And in addition to that, I'm only as good as the sources that I read. And this is your yearly reminder that not all sources are as credible as you want them to be. And so, yeah, that little bit of information, I did verify that, and that is true. And I'm happy that that was pointed out. Thank you so much for doing that. And that also gave me another name to put on the list of podcast stories that I want to look into and see if I can create an episode out of them. But that is not what we're talking about today. Today, we are talking about how on December 29th, 1972, Don stood at a payphone in New York's JFK Airport calling his wife, Alice. He never failed to call her when he landed and he was safely off the plane, and he knew that this settled her anxiousness each and every time. They spoke for a moment, and he said that as long as they continued to stay on track, timing-wise, he would be home by midnight, and he couldn't wait to see her. They hung up the phone, and Don made his way to the terminal for the next flight, JFK to Miami. 51-year-old Don was the flight engineer for the L-1011 TriStar, and he was responsible for monitoring and operating the operating system that was on the plane. The job was demanding, and when 8 p.m. rolled around, it was time for him to start the pre-flight checks for the 3-hour flight. As far as the plane goes, it was relatively new as far as, passenger planes go. The Lockheed L 1011, and I'm not actually sure that I'm saying that correctly. It could be L1011, not sure. It was a TriStar, and it was a huge plane. It could accommodate up to 400 passengers, and it sat with 8 seats per row. The plane also had 2 levels, one for the passengers and the seats, and then staff could take a small elevator down to the second level where there was a small room with refrigerators and ovens and a full-size kitchen for staff to use. Climbing into the cockpit, 55-year-old pilot Captain Bob Loft and 45-year-old co-pilot First Officer Albert Stockstill began their routine checks. Also on board were 10 flight attendants and 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo, who was a technical specialist. And while he wasn't on duty for this flight, it always seemed to ease minds when there was an extra set of hands available. Now, while this plane was relatively new, Captain Loft had 30,000 flight hours under his belt. He was a perfectionist, and he had no problem delaying flights to make sure that everything was working the way it was supposed to. Others had also mentioned that he was just really calm and collected during tense events, and even when things got sketchy, he just never seemed fazed. First Officer Albert Stockstill sat immediately to the right of Captain Loft, and in many planes, this is all the space there is available. But on this plane, due to its size, there were 2 additional seats. One was taken by Don Repo, and the other was by Angelo Donadeo. Angelo, being the technical specialist for the plane, specialized in this specific plane. He knew the plane inside and out, and even though he wasn't working, he was still willing to provide insight. As passengers shuffled onto the plane and into their seats, attendant Stephanie Stanich and Patricia Gazelle worked at the back of the plane. They were smiling and talking about their upcoming plans and greeting passengers and helping them to their seats. One of those passengers was Rosario Messina. At 46 years old, Rosario was feeling very perplexed with this flight. He had no reason to believe that this would be any different from any other flight that he had ever been on. Yet, he couldn't shake the premonition he had had, even going so far as to tell his wife that he believed he would die young. But he returned Stephanie's easy smile and sat in his seat. At 9:10 p.m., all 176 passengers and crew members were on board. Pre-flight checks were complete, and Captain Loft came over the intercom announcing to prepare for takeoff. It was 9:20 p.m. when the plane's tires lifted from the runway and into the air, and they were off for Miami, a flight that would drastically change the fates for everyone involved. The flight itself went smooth, and when they began their approach to Miami International Airport, First Officer Stockstill lowered the landing gear. On the dash, there are lights for each of the wheel wells, and this tells the pilot and co-pilot who are in the cockpit that the wheels are down and locked in and ready for landing. But this time, the 2 rear lights were the only ones to light up green. The front wheel light stayed off, indicating that the landing gear at the nose of the plane failed to come out. Like many planes, this one had a wheel that would come down and lock under the right wing, the left wing, and the nose of the plane. Captain Loft is alerted of this and immediately just retracts the plane's wheels, and then once they are locked back inside the plane, he releases them again, and still the light does not turn on, indicating that the nose wheel is out and ready for use. Generally, when this light does not turn green, there is something with the light itself that is faulty rather than the wheel. And even when the wheel does fail to come down, it can be done so manually. This is nothing to panic about. Captain Loft simply tells air control that he is going to make a loop around while they address the issue and then come in for a landing. Air control confirms that they received the message and then mentions to fly out over the Everglades National Park. First Officer Stockstill then turns on the autopilot to keep the plane at 2,000 feet of altitude and flying at about 200 miles per hour, so that he and Captain Loft are able to examine the control deck. They assume that the bulb of the light, is faulty, especially because the plane is practically new and it had worked when they were going through their pre-flight checks. Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill began to mess with the light. They press on it, they wiggle it, they twist it, and when the light still doesn't come on, they pull the light out of the panel. They do the Nintendo blow on it and try to get the dust off of it thing, and then press it back into place, and still nothing. Now, they need to put eyes on the landing gear. So Don makes his way down into the small compartment which sits below the cockpit to visually see whether the wheel has come down or not. As the plane flew, it glides away from Miami and out over the vast and only subtropical preserve in North America known as Everglades National Park. The Everglades is the only place in the world where crocodiles and alligators coexist in the wild. It is home to the largest mangrove ecosystem in the Western Hemisphere and has the largest seagrass meadow in the world. This is the third largest national park, but much of it is underwater. Whether that be a few inches or a few feet, this is the only national park that was created in order to protect the ecosystem first, and beauty was kind of a secondary factor. So, like with many parks, there is this visual beauty that people fall in love with first, and then they have the desire to protect it. The water here is more swamp than the ocean that surrounds much of Florida. The waters are full of grass and mud, creating a hazy and dark effect to the water, which is perfect for crocodiles and alligators to hide in. There are several threatened species protected here, including the American crocodile, the Florida panther, and manatees, with 350 different species of birds, 300 species of fish, 40 species of mammals, and I am surprised that the number of reptiles is only at 50. I definitely thought that number would be higher. At this point above the Everglades, for some reason, the plane begins to drop in altitude. But because Donald was not in his seat and he did not hear the ringing that acted as an alarm, and with the dark sky and the dark water surrounding them, Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill failed to notice the descent as well. Angelo, the technical specialist who was not working, but rather was a passenger on the plane, he made his way down into the compartment with Donald. But it was about at this same time that Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill figured out that the light was in fact faulty and the wheel was down. It was 11:42 p.m. First Officer Stockstill began to turn the plane to the left so that way they could swoop around and go towards the airport once again. And he got this odd sensation of doom. He had noticed the ground was coming up to meet them without realizing that this is what he was seeing.
Hi everyone, I'm Cindy, the host of True Crime California, a weekly podcast about murders and other true crime that takes place in the Great Golden State. Join me every week as I talk about a new case, some very well known and others not so well known, but always coming straight out of California. True Crime California is a proud member of the Darkcast Network.
The angle that the plane hit the ground was just right because it was descending at a more gradual pace rather than falling out of the sky. And so it just kind of coasted and then skidded along the water until it came to a stop in the muck. This soft ground landing also resulted in a little bit of a cushion, which meant that it wasn't a total catastrophe. Asterisks, it doesn't mean that this wasn't still horrible. In the next few moments, unexplained things would begin to occur. Sadie Messina, Rosario's wife, was standing in the airport waiting for her husband's arrival when she heard him whistling a song that he liked. But when she turned around to find him, he was not there. I just got full body chills reading that. Again, I've read it multiple times, and that one gets me. It would be Bob Marquis and his friend who arrived at the scene of the plane crash first. They had been out frog hunting in Bob's boat, which was a flat air boat style boat with a big fan on the back, and he saw the explosion from Flight 401 hitting the water. It took him several moments to comprehend what it was he was seeing, especially because the burst of light was swallowed up so quickly, and Bob's friend didn't see a thing. 30 minutes later, the Coast Guard arrived in helicopters, and between Bob, his friends, and the Coast Guard, they spent most of the night freeing people from the water. By the time the sun rose the following morning, every single person was accounted for, whether they had died or had been rushed to the hospital. Donald would survive the wreck, but as time wore on, he continued to decline. Despite the best efforts of all of the members of medical staff, Donald would die 30 hours after the crash. In all, 101 people would die, either from the crash or due to injuries from the crash, with 75 more surviving. An investigation ensued in which it was found that Captain Bob Loft had likely bumped his gear shift at some point, disengaging the autopilot, which kept the plane flying at 2,000 feet. Because of this, no one had any idea that the plane was descending until it was far too late. In addition to this, the investigation found that the wheel was in perfect working order. The entire problem was a result of the light bulb being burnt out. Much of the plane was still in good condition despite the crash, and this was likely due to the fact that when the plane hit the ground and exploded, the swampy Everglades put out the resulting fire before it could spread to the entire plane. Because of this, some of the parts of the plane were harvested and reused in other builds of the same model. But this is not where the story ends. When Alice and her children returned home after Dawn passed away, dozens of birds somehow got trapped in their screened-in porch. Dawn loved to sit and watch the birds at the bird feeders while he drank his morning coffee. Same. And as Alice stood there and watched them flutter about the room, they finally relaxed, and one by one, they slipped out the hole in the screen which they had to have come in. When the plane crashed, multiple people mentioned that they saw Stephanie Stanich, one of the flight attendants, struggling out of the plane and then clumsily staggering away through the swamp, which is something that they learned later was impossible because during the investigation, they found that she died on impact. In March of 1973, nearly 3 months after the crash in the Everglades, Eastern Airlines Flight 318 was flying from New York to Fort Lauderdale in Florida. While preparing meals for passengers on one of the flights, a flight attendant by the name of Denise went into the plane's galley to heat up some of the meals, so that lower section is where she went into. In this area, there are refrigerators and ovens, and when she stepped into the space, she noticed that Ginny, another flight attendant, was no longer there. She did not pay any mind to this, though, and got to warming meals. Suddenly, she felt that she was no longer alone, but when she turned around, she saw no one. She thought maybe one of the other flight attendants was playing a trick on her, so she began opening up all of the doors, and that feeling of not being alone only intensified as she found no one there. Then, a few weeks later, a different flight attendant who was on the same plane was alone in the galley when the temperature plummeted dramatically, almost as if someone turned the air on and she was standing in front of the vent. Thinking that something was wrong with the heating system, the flight engineer showed up and found out that there was nothing wrong, and the temperature was actually at a cozy 90 degrees, though he too felt the chill. More stories began to emerge about this specific plane, which was the same model as Flight 401. Another flight attendant was spooked when she looked at her reflection in the oven and was frightened when the face that looked back at her was not her own. Then a different flight attendant had the same thing happen. The flight engineer, more intrigued than anything, went down to investigate. When he did, he noticed that the face that appeared back at him looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was then that he had a sudden knowing that a fire was going to break out in one of the plane's engines. The reflection seemed to nod back at him as if to say, "Yes, you got it." And then suddenly he got a call that one of the engines was malfunctioning. Then there are odder stories, like that of a different flight on 318, where Sis, a flight attendant, was making her way down the row, counting passengers as they settled in for their flight. She was doing this quickly to identify if everyone was on board, but when she was done, she realized that she was over by one. As she turned around in the front of the plane, she noticed a man in a pilot's uniform sitting in first class, and she realized that that was why she was over by one. She assumed that he was deadheading, which is when a pilot who needs to get to a different airport to fly a plane will hop on one of the company's other flights so that way they can get there. They don't really have to have a ticket or anything, as this was a pretty common thing to have happen, at least in the 70s, but still she needed to be able to identify him and have him on record for being on this plane. She approached him and she says, "Hi, I'm Sis. Can I get your name and are you deadheading?" And he just doesn't even acknowledge that she's there. He is just staring directly at the seat in front of him. She repeats herself, and then another flight attendant, Diane, comes over and hears Sis ask for a third time, but this man just still isn't answering. By now, other passengers are noticing this weird interaction, so Sis decides that she's going to go ahead and go get the pilot, George, and have him come deal with it. When George comes out, he kneels down so that he is at the man's eye level, and when he looks in the face of the extra pilot, he is stunned to see Captain Bob Loft staring back at him. George doesn't know Bob because of photos. He was good friends with Bob. George is so surprised that he kind of falls backwards a bit and exclaims, "That's Bob Loft." And as their attention is turned towards George, and we all know how cramped planes can be, the captain vanishes from his seat. People are a bit worried at this point and they're shaken up. They end up delaying this flight and telling the passengers to stay in their seats so that way they can search the plane for this man. And many saw this man on the plane. And as they search the plane, they just find nothing. Eventually, they do have a safe flight to their destination, but this is just one of numerous reports about sightings of both Bob Loft and Don Repo that were reported over the years. Eastern Airlines would eventually remove and replace all of the repurposed parts from Flight 401, and while this ended the sightings, it certainly hasn't ended the stories about the ghosts of Flight 401. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you being here. Come back next week. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.